Good afternoon and welcome to the Spanish Council of Civil Engineers. It's a pleasure for us to share this session with all of you. We really appreciate your interest and your participation here with us today, and also to those who follow us virtually from different countries. This is a very special event due to the close relationship that the Spanish Council of Civil Engineers has had for many years with the Institution of Civil Engineers in the United Kingdom, and we are delighted to host its presidential visit to Europe. We especially acknowledge to his president, Ed McCann, for choosing the city of Madrid and the institution for holding this relevant event. Thank you very much, Ed. I'm also pleased to announce that the cooperation framework between the two institutions has been reinforced, and a cooperation agreement has just been signed by the presidents, and that will certainly give us the opportunity to work together in future in activities as the one we carry out today. To inaugurate this session, and before we start the ICE presidential address, I would like to invite our President, Miguel Ángel Carrillo, to take this place and to address a few words to all of us. Miguel Ángel, please.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon. I am pleased to welcome you all to Spain and to the Colegio de Ingenieros de Caminos, Canales y Puertos. La verdad es que es un placer albergar un acto de la Institution Civil Engineer. Quiero comenzar trasladando, en nombre de nuestra institución, nuestras más sinceras condolencias a todos nuestros compañeros ingleses por el fallecimiento de la reina Isabel II. La reina ha sido una figura fundamental en la historia contemporánea del Reino Unido y, desde luego, del mundo. Me sumo al agradecimiento que ha dicho Esther Ahijado al ICE. Nos honra acoger este año, de luego, la visita presidencial del ICE a Europa, y de luego es una satisfacción contar con la presidencia de su presidente, Ed McCann. Ed, es un placer recibirte en el colegio. Esta es tu casa, como he tenido la oportunidad de decirte anteriormente. Esperamos que juntos sigamos contribuyendo al desarrollo de la ingeniería civil, tanto en el Reino Unido como en España. En esta jornada, además, podemos disfrutar de la conferencia de Kate Kern, que nos hablará sobre logística de construcción y seguridad comunitaria. Muchas gracias, Kate, por tu participación en este acto. Vivimos, desde luego, en una marcada época llena de incertidumbre social, económica, que está generada por diferentes crisis: la económica, la sanitaria, la crisis geopolítica, la grave emergencia humanitaria que está provocando la invasión armada de Rusia a Ucrania y la crisis climática. Por lo que todo hace prever que vamos a tener unos meses próximos muy complicados, sobre todo en materia hidrológica y energética. Hace unos días el presidente del Gobierno de España, Pedro Sánchez, ya utilizaba por primera vez la palabra recesión. En este escenario complejo e incierto, pues el colectivo profesional, desde luego, de ingenieros de caminos, canales y puertos, manifestamos nuestro compromiso y vocación de contribuir a superar los grandes desafíos a los que nos enfrentamos, y para ello necesitamos, de luego, unir fuerzas con muchos socios. Por ello, nos complace anunciar que con el ICE y el Colegio de Ingenieros de Caminos hemos firmado un convenio que va a potenciar la relación entre ambas instituciones. Este acuerdo representa una oportunidad, desde luego, para nuestros colegiados en ejercer una profesión, nuestra profesión, en el Reino Unido, y también para los asociados ingleses que quieran venir o que estén ya en España, para el avance también de su profesión dentro de nuestro país y de la ingeniería civil en general. De esta manera, la relación entre el colegio y el ICE toman un nuevo alcance que va a beneficiar a toda la sociedad. Para aquellos que luego que nos seguís desde otros países, quiero enviaros un saludo cordial y permitidme que dé un apunte de nuestro colegio. Este colegio, que está integrado actualmente por más de 25.000 ingenieros de caminos, canales y puertos, regula la profesión de este colectivo desde el año 1954. La constante búsqueda de la excelencia y nuestro afán de sentido público han permitido que nuestros profesionales hayan liderado los grandes proyectos que han contribuido al gran desarrollo económico y social de las últimas décadas, tanto en nuestro país como en el mundo. Más de 500 ingenieros de caminos, canales y puertos ejercen la profesión en el Reino Unido, siendo este el primer país del extranjero con mayor número de nuestros colegiados, y por lo que nos consta que una gran parte de ellos también pertenecen al ICE. Desde el colegio estamos comprometidos con todos ellos y con lo que se encuentra también en otros países para apoyarles y acompañarles en su actividad profesional. Por ello, en estos 2 primeros años de gestión de esta Junta de Gobierno del colegio, y que tengo el honor de presidir, uno de los compromisos que nos hemos marcado es el de consolidar y ampliar la colaboración con colegios y asociaciones profesionales de distintos países, favorecer la movilidad profesional, impulsar la cooperación y el intercambio de conocimientos y experiencias con otras organizaciones, así como desarrollar programas de formación continua para los profesionales y la defensa de la deontología profesional, son objetivos determinantes que hemos marcado. En el Colegio de Ingenieros de Caminos, Canales y Puertos sabemos de la importancia de nuestros profesionales y empresas, no solo en España, sino en todo el mundo. Por ello, nos gustaría contribuir de manera decisiva para que nuestros colegiados puedan trabajar en el país donde deseen y en las mejores condiciones. También sabemos que España es un país interesante para invertir y de una calidad de vida extraordinaria. Y queremos ayudar a los ingenieros civiles de todo el mundo a que tengan un lugar de trabajo aquí. En esta línea de compromisos, el pasado año creamos la figura del precolegiado internacional, que permite el acceso a muchos de los servicios que presta el colegio a los colegiados o asociados de las instituciones homólogas con las que tenemos convenios, como es el caso del ICE. En un mundo global, con grandes desafíos relacionados con nuestra profesión, el cambio climático que hemos mencionado, la transición energética o la movilidad sostenible y sus consecuencias en el suministro y abastecimiento de agua y energía, es indispensable que nuestras instituciones estrechen aún más su colaboración. Estoy seguro de que el convenio que hemos firmado hoy y actos como este que van a contribuir a aumentar y fortalecer nuestros lazos de colaboración en defensa de un colectivo profesional que es decisivo para el desarrollo económico y social de nuestros países. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you, Miguel Ángel, for opening the session and for your very appropriate messages. We keep on going with the program. I would like to introduce our colleague, Enrique Huertas, who will be in charge to moderate the ICE presidential address. Thank you very much, Enrique, for participating today. Enrique is the ICE country representative for Spain, and he is also a member of the Spanish Council of Civil Engineers. He will introduce Ed McCann's intervention on the principles that have ruled his presidential year in the ICE. And he will be followed by our special guest, Kate Kearns. Kate, we really appreciate your presence here today. She will present her project Clocks and her vision about how engineers can transform lives and shape the world around us. After these 2 interventions, we will open a time for the dialogue, and all the questions you would like to ask will be answered. For those who follow us virtually, they can send his questions through the Zoom chat, and they will also be answered. I now hand over to my colleague Enrique, and he can follow the program.
Great. Thank you very much, Esther. Thank you very much, Colegio de Ingenieros de Caminos. Thank you, Miguel Ángel. We are here indeed to celebrate civil engineering, and we are delighted, in fact, as myself, and I'm not speaking just for myself, as the representative of ICE in Spain, that this event, the presidential address of the President of the ICE in Europe, will take place in Madrid. Last time it actually took place in person was in 2010, prior to COVID. So, it really is an honor that Madrid is the place. go back to normal, as to say. We also have to be very thankful indeed to Ed and Kate. Miguel Angel mentioned the country, the UK, is at grief for the loss of Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II. Elizabeth the Queen, she was indeed patron of the Institution of Civil Engineers for most of her reign, and we can only feel gratitude for that, for her life and work. I'm not going to take more time to give way to the event, to the presidential address. So, Ed, please welcome to the stage.
I'm okay. Yeah, well, good evening, everyone, and well, thanks for coming. I first came to Madrid in 1987. I had a girlfriend who was from Madrid, and I've had a little love affair with Madrid ever since. And so it really is no problem to come to Madrid and meet Spanish people and eat great food and drink great wine. So, and I've also had the great fortune of working with a number of Spanish engineers during my whole career, actually. And I say sincerely, some of the best in the world, really top class engineers who do amazing projects. And I was involved in the Barcelona Bull Ring project and the engineers who did that. If you ever get a chance to see a 90-metre timber grid shell and a 100-year-old building being held up on stilts, and the Spanish engineers who made that possible, it's a true international calibre project. So, pleasure for me. Many thanks, Miguel. Many thanks to the Colegio for hosting us this evening. And we're being made to feel very welcome, and I hope we can entertain you a little bit this evening. Kate is going to come on after me. She's much better, so it's only going to improve from here. But I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the institution and talk about how we hope things will work with the Colegio. So we're finding out today more about each other. We've had a long chat this afternoon, and most of you will know that both of our institutions are really interested in making sure that society gets the infrastructure that it needs. That's what we're all about. We're about making sure that engineers are of the best quality possible and that they give society the service that society needs. That's what both the Colegio and the Institution of Civil Engineers exist to do. Part of that is about continually learning from each other, about refreshing and developing the knowledge that is associated with doing what we do. Learning how to do bridges better every year, learning how to deal with things we didn't know we had to deal with, like climate change. And you're going to hear this evening about a whole body of work looking at logistics, construction logistics and community safety, things that perhaps weren't a great focus for us a few years ago, but increasingly need to be. So this is by way of us coming over here and sharing some of our observations and some of our experience. And I very much look forward to over the next months and years to seeing these great Spanish engineers talking about their projects with us in London and elsewhere, so that we can learn from you about the things that you've done. So, without further ado, I'm going to take you through we're going to kick off my little piece. I'm going to try to anyway. There we are. Right. So I'm sure most of you will recognise those as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I took on my presidency after Rachel Skinner, who I'm sure many of you will have seen and know. And Rachel made an absolute focus, or had an absolute focus in her year, on the issue of carbon and climate change. And she left us all with a huge challenge. We said, what are you going to do about it? This is an existential challenge that the world faces in the 21st century. It's not something over the horizon, it's happening now. And what are we going to do about it as engineers? And she was very eloquent and very effective at getting her message across. And what we're trying to do is build on that. So I've picked up from her. And she asked me, what are you going to do about it? And I said, well, I'm going to focus on what I think civil engineers can do to do that. Because we can talk about carbon, we can talk about climate change, but what do we do as engineers every day that will make a difference on this theme? Because frankly, as civil engineers, if we're not addressing this stuff, we're not doing our jobs. The role of the civil engineer is to do the stuff on that page. It's to help address poverty, hunger, ensure that people have health and well-being, make sure that they've got facilities to get an education in, deal with all of this stuff. That's what we do. We provide infrastructure for society to do those things. And I think we always need to challenge ourselves. Good engineers have always said, what can I do better tomorrow? It's not about, I did a great job in the past. It's about continually improving and making sure we're doing what society needs now and into the future. And so what we did this year was we took the idea that productivity, and I'll explain a little bit more about what we mean by productivity, that productivity was something we as engineers could really help with. And what do we mean by productivity? I don't know how familiar that term is to you, but to an economist, productivity is basically a measure of salaries and company profits. But that's not very helpful to us. What we're interested in is something else. And what we've settled on, having spoken to lots of engineers about this, is the dual concepts of effectiveness and efficiency. And just if you dwell on those for a moment, as an engineer, we want to do projects that are effective, that deliver outcomes, that bridges that link communities and enable commerce and trade. We want to do projects that improve public health, that have effect. And secondly, we want to do those projects really, really efficiently, without waste. We want to use the minimum amount of materials that are necessary to deliver the work. We want to make sure that we use minimum amounts of energy during the life of the work. We want to use less resources and do less harm to the environment that we occupy. And these two things drive us as engineers, and if they don't, they should. Are we doing the right stuff, and are we doing it right? And for us, productivity, improving productivity is about both of those things. It's about making sure we do the right projects that deliver maximum positive benefit for society, and making sure we do those projects without waste. So how do we do against that? Are we good at this stuff? The infrastructure productivity challenge. I don't know, do people in the room think we've got it nailed? Are we good at the moment? Hands up if you think no problems, we're on it, we're super productive. Okay, well, in the UK, we started looking at our industry's performance in the 1930s. We've written over 100 worthy reports since the 1930s talking about the deficiencies in our performance as a sector, challenging ourselves continually to improve. And there's been a lot going on recently, and yeah, I've had the great good fortune to read a number of these reports over recent years, and they don't paint a pretty picture. They tell us that we're getting a lot of stuff wrong. If I said to you, okay, what proportion of projects are both on time, on budget, and deliver the benefits that they were meant to deliver. So if you imagine you're doing your highway scheme, you do your economic case at the beginning, you say, this is what it's going to cost, this is how long it's going to take, and these are the economic benefits that are going to flow from that project. So measured when you decided to do the job, what proportion of infrastructure projects achieve all three of those goals? Don't be shy, shout out. 10%? 50%? You'd like to think it was 100%. What do we think it is? It's as close to zero as you can get. So this is a review of from the Global Infrastructure Projects Database, or Global Projects Database, that looked at 16,357 projects and found that 0.5% of them were on budget, on time, and on benefits. So we've got plenty of room for improvement when it comes to delivering on our goals. And if you, this is work done at the University of Oxford, and where do I point this thing? There we are. And this is a breakdown of by project type. And we're of course very interested in roads and rail and dams and nuclear waste storage and those. And if you look in there, what you see is a consistent story of very significant cost overruns, very significant schedule overruns, and very significant under-delivery on benefits. So what's going on? What about effectiveness? What are we getting wrong on effectiveness? Well, in part, we're not planning our projects right, and we're not deciding on the right projects to do. We're not critical enough or thoughtful enough about which projects to invest in. As a sector, we love building stuff. Everyone gets very excited. Let's do a bridge. Let's do a bridge. And as soon as there's a chance of doing a bridge, we stop asking the question, should we do a bridge? Quite often, we are sucked into a commercial journey towards doing something, anything, without really scrutinising, is this absolutely necessary and is this delivering the benefit that we want it to do? Quite often we don't actually consider all of the benefits that might fall to society. We count only the easy to measure economic benefits. But I think fundamentally our problem is that we don't know how to pick projects very well. We haven't got good criteria on which to decide where to make our investments and what projects to do. And that flows through in that they don't actually then deliver in the way that we hope they will. And as to efficiency, so how efficiently we are, I'm going to rattle through this list and I'm going to horrify a lot of people in this room. But I assure you that the information on this slide is reliable. So 10 to 25% of project costs arise from perfectly avoidable error in the whole process. 10 to 25% of all costs are associated with error. 25 to 50% of structural materials are not necessary to comply with codes. Buildings are not falling down, but slabs are fatter today than they were 30 years ago. Columns are fatter, slabs are fatter. This is an observation. I'm sure in Spain you're much better than this, by the way. But if we take a sort of global average, and certainly in the UK, this is true. Codes, in any case, are designed to cater for the least competent designers, contractors, owners, operators, and users, and hence are very conservative. Some 10 to 15% of materials by value brought to construction sites are wasted. This is particularly true in the building sector. Does anyone know in this room how much concrete is thrown away? If we were in a manufacturing sector, you'd know the answer to that question. We would know what was on the drawings and what was brought to site and what the difference between those two numbers is. You'd be really interested in it if you're in the manufacturing sector. We don't even measure it. But when you do measure it, and I've spoken to several contractors who've done deep dives on this, they're finding 10 and 15% of the concrete they build to sites ends up on the floor, straight away, over-ordered, thrown on the floor. Rejected because of quality, thrown on the floor. 10 to 15% of the concrete that we use in our industry ends up like that. And so it goes for loads of materials. It's probably even worse for reinforcing steel. Construction programs and schedules are circa 17% suboptimal. This is work done at Stanford University by a guy called René Marcos. And this is about taking P6 programs that are done manually and then running algorithmic optimization on them to balance labour, resources and optimize timeframes. 17% of programs. And that's all of your preliminary costs flow with those programs. Multi-tier procurement leads to waste in both prelims and management. So a big project done in the UK over recent years looking at how contracting leads to waste in cost through additional administration, contractual fighting at tier boundaries. And they believe somewhere in the order of 20% of the cost of projects are attackable by revising the procurement and contracting strategies. Labour utilisation appears to be in the range of 40 to 60% on average. Lots of people think it's much worse than that. So on linear infrastructure, you'll typically hear numbers like 30%, i.e. that's the amount of time that people are usefully working. The rest of the time, what are they doing? They're waiting for instruction, they're waiting for materials, they're waiting for tools, or they're waiting for access to the workface. We don't actually know in detail what this is. If I said to you, if you've got a construction project, what is your labour utilisation on that? If we were in a manufacturing sector, we'd know. We don't know. We don't measure it, but it's low. Plant utilisation is probably worse than that, particularly on small plant and small tools. A good friend of mine, he's brought in as a fixer on big projects, and when he comes into the project, he said to me, Ed, I always do two things. What do you do, Damien? What do you do? He says, number one, I sack someone. I say, Damien, why do you sack someone? He says, well, because it sets the right tone, he says. And then what's the second thing you do, Damien? He says, I off-hire all the equipment. I send it all back. I take it off-hire. And do you know how much comes back within a week or two? Is less than 50% of the material that's been off-hired. We have a huge problem of bringing stuff to site and then just leaving it there and not using it. And we have organisations in our supply chain benefit from process waste. If you are selling concrete, are you happy or sad that the designer has over-specified the concrete and there's more concrete? Well, as a concrete supplier, I'm delighted, whether it was necessary or not. Are you happy or sad when the contractor has a bad day and makes a mistake and throws it all on the floor or orders the wrong stuff, well, brilliant, I'll get paid twice. Is the designer happy or sad when the client makes a mistake and doesn't get planning permission and you have to design the building again and again and again? Well, you're delighted. You're getting paid, no risk. And so we have a supply chain where designers are benefiting. Everyone's benefiting from the mistakes that people next to them make in the process. We have a poorly aligned supply chain, and that leads to business models that depend on waste. That's not a healthy place to be. It means we become endemically wasteful. Okay, so this is my sort of punchline. I think as a sector we suffer from gross and endemic waste in most, if not all, of our processes. The opportunity for improvement is huge. I think numbers like 30 to 50% in cost, program, materials consumption, environmental impact are all perfectly attackable if we get our act together. And in case you feel too down about this sort of stuff was commonplace in manufacturing in the 70s and 80s. They had error rates running up at sort of 25, 30%. They're down at 1% now. And we'll come on to that in a little bit. And what's the reason for this? Is I think that over a long period of time, we haven't focused enough on value. We've been too interested in doing the project and not interested enough in the project working, delivering value to society. We've become dependent on building rather than solving the problems and delivering the outcomes that society needs. We don't have anything like sufficient focus on waste. We don't even measure it. We don't even categorise it in most circumstances. And when we count skips, we're counting a tiny proportion of the waste. We're really not focused on waste in the way that you would be if you were in manufacturing, and we've got no good reason not to. We don't use technology to enhance value and cost in nearly effectively enough a way, and there are a number of reasons for that. And partly because of this waste, benefiting from waste thing, we don't have very good enterprise models. So it's hard for companies to invest. And I know the situation, I'm serious when I say it may not be precisely like this in Spain, but this work looks at international projects and international scenarios. So I can't say for sure because I've never studied the situation in Spain, but I have looked at it across Northern Europe, Australia, America and the UK, and this is everywhere. So some suggestions for improvement. What can we do about this? Well, the first thing I think you need to do, and this is a very summarised version, by the way, there's a lot longer version of this presentation, which I'll bore you with another time, but we have to get focused on the front end of projects, much more than we do at the moment. And that doesn't mean flooding the front of projects with bodies. It means flooding the front end of projects with insight, intelligence, good engineering thinking, close collaboration with the society that you serve. This graph, which is an influence time graph, will be familiar to you, that your biggest influence on a project is at the start. You determine whether the project's going to be a success by setting it up right, by getting the right team together, by making sure that the concept design and the scheme structure is correct. So we need to do that better. That's not the same as just pouring money on the front end of a job, which we sometimes do, and all we do is buy more complexity and more confusion. So focus on the front end. Secondly, we need to prioritise ruthlessly. And we need to prioritise those things that do more of what we like. When we talk about carbon, and I mean, as a sort of designer, I spend my life, the last 10, 15 years, we've been talking about how do we reduce carbon in our buildings and all the rest of it. And it's amazing how often you end up talking about on-site power generation, new rare materials, even carbon capture at source and things like, high quality offset. That's the nature of the discussion. Now, all of those at the moment increase cost and are hard to deliver carbon reductions on in many, many circumstances. There are, however, 4 things there that are both reducing cost, reducing program and reducing carbon. And we don't talk about them so much. So the optimal strategic choices, making sure that the proposition is in itself optimal. It's delivering value all the way through in the optimal fashion. We don't talk about that. That's the biggest determinant of the carbon outcome of a project is there, and the cost outcome. We don't talk enough about lean design and lean construction. We don't challenge our designers. There's no contract out there that says you've got to design to 100% utilisation of materials in your structures. What we say is the structure's got to stand up. So we get structures that stand up, but they might have 5 times more material in them than they actually need. And we don't even investigate that. We do far too little on lean construction. And we don't try and get rid of the errors I was talking about. Where are the error reduction programs? If you were in manufacturing, you'd see error reduction programs. Anybody working on a project with an error reduction program? We just don't do these things, and all of these things generate all of the waste and all of the excess use of materials, carbon consumption and so on that I was talking about. So what we need to do is we need to prioritise those things which both reduce cost, deliver better social value, reduce carbon and so on. And let's leave carbon capture and storage just down the road a little bit. Let's focus on these and let's just leave some of those other things a little bit down the road. This report in that box there called Changing to Compete was done in 2009. I think it's probably the most under-celebrated report I've read in this great sort of pantheon of reports. A key fact, they looked at hundreds of engineering projects around the globe, and what they did was they normalised them. So they would take sewage treatment works and they would try to get rid of all of the differences, and then they do comparisons on how much and how long did it take to deliver this functionality. Those X megalitres a day of sewage treatment per £1 million or whatever the numbers were. And what they found is summed up as follows, is that the best performing projects were 20 to 30% better than average, and the worst performing projects were 20 to 30% worse than average. What that means is that on projects which are essentially the same, the difference between good and bad performance isn't 1%, it's not 2%, it's not a bad Tuesday afternoon. It's plus or minus 30%. That is enormous. And it begs the question, what's the difference? What is driving that difference across these projects? Why are some projects almost twice as good in terms of their productivity measured in this way than others? What is going on? And it tells us that actually the best thing we can do is focus on making our best everything. So let's get the worst performing projects to be as good as our best performing projects. Because in that way, without doing anything fancy, without inventing amazing new technology, we will have delivered a huge benefit to society. So working on our worst performing projects and making them, and the people who do them, able to do our best performing projects is really, really important. I think a key point here is to talk about, these worst performing projects, it's not like they're falling down. It's not like they don't, in the end, comply with codes. They're not unsafe. And a lot of our focus and in the discussion this afternoon, we're worried about engineers designing buildings that fall down. We're terrified that buildings we certify are unsafe. But it's more than just safe. There is something about value to society. We're giving them one hospital. Instead, they could have had two. Both safe. Because we're not doing our job as efficiently as we might. Lots of reasons for that, by the way. Error elimination, I'll draw your attention to this. This is a research project, and now 70 organisations signed up to try and go after error reduction. It should be shocking to us, the idea that as much as 20-25% of project costs are associated with error. And most people start by going, it can't be right, it doesn't feel like my experience. But when you burrow into it, you rapidly come to the conclusion it's quite often a lot more than that. I haven't got time to go into that now, but I do commend to you that research project if you want to know more. And the sort of thing that underpins this, and there's something a bit weird about this, so that's a fairly typical occurrence. They've had a bad day. I don't know whether they just ran out of concrete, whether they ordered it wrong in the first place. I don't know whether the concrete pump broke down, but they didn't manage to fill the shutter. But if you just look at that and you go, so that's a very easy mistake to make. It's happening all the time on projects all over the place. So what are the consequences of that? Fixing that is going to cost much more than the structure cost in the first place. By the time we break all of that down, by the time we go back through an approvals process to see, can I have a cold joint in the middle of this pour? Can I get a pour onto these bars, or have I got to scabble them? To say nothing of the indirect delays that they can't get access to whatever was on the other side of it, and we're going to have to get the crane back over to this side of the site. That's it. So something that getting it right would have cost them nothing, and getting it wrong is costing them 25, 30, 50,000 euros to sort that mess out, depending on the indirect costs. So there's a huge asymmetry, particularly on complex projects, that comes out of fairly simple errors that are happening all the time. We could go on for a long time about errors, because that's... Yeah, process. So civil engineering, how many of you think civil engineering is a process? That design, construction, commissioning, operation are processes? A few people nodding around the room. How many of you have ever studied process engineering? Have ever been on a course called process engineering or studied process optimization? If you're a chemical engineer, you say chemical engineering is a process, and I've done tons of courses on process engineering. We, on the whole, don't have a language that goes with process. Now, we kind of know it's a process, and we kind of know there are inputs and activities and outputs, but when it comes to the techniques that process engineers, like zero loss to yield analysis and fishbone diagrams, a whole toolkit that process engineers use to understand and improve their processes, we don't have them. We never learnt them, and we don't think like that. And I think that's what we've got to do. And the work we've been doing suggests it's definitely what we've got to do, is we've got to get inside the value-adding processes that we deliver and continually improve them. And to do that requires us to behave differently. Waste. If you look at, many of you will have heard of Toyota production systems, the sort of precursor to lean, the lean movement. Comes out of Toyota and the Japanese manufacturing miracle. And the guy who was behind all of that had two ideas that were like an articles of religious faith for him. And one of them was that you had to ruthlessly focus on value to the consumer. The car had to be for the consumer. And the other thing was you get rid of waste. Those two ideas are at the core of the Toyota production system miracle. And if you look at cars, so when you say, you will all say to me, oh no, what we do is complicated and you can't have more functionality for less cost. That doesn't work. If you want more functionality in your building, you're going to pay more. And then I turn around to you and say, well, what about cars? Cars in real terms cost a third of what they did in 1970. And in their functionality, they're probably about 8 times better. I'm making those numbers up, by the way, but you know what I mean. Is cars have got better and cheaper at the same time. Buildings haven't got better and cheaper at all, nor has roads. We haven't got better and cheaper. And the way that they did it in manufacturing, by ruthlessly focusing on value and the elimination of waste, the application of technology to help them deliver their processes more efficiently. Now, in infrastructure, and one of the big problems with transferring the experience of lean into infrastructure, in my opinion, is that they took manufacturing and focused on construction rather than the total process. And we're different because we design, the importance of design in our projects is much greater than it is in the typical manufacturing process. We have to redesign for context, for sites every time. So it's not enough just to point your lens, your effort into the construction phase. You've got to deal with design as well. And we also have some inputs to our process that they don't have. And this piece of work, which was done for HS2, is looking at the inputs that infrastructure has, because in understanding what we've got to do to improve our processes, we've got to understand our own waste streams and input streams. And critically, we have land and ecosystem as inputs, and they don't. Land is a huge issue for us in construction and in planning our routes. And the ecosystem damage that we do associate with that's just not a thing in lean. They have a factory, it doesn't move. And similarly, we are critically dependent on social capital. Now, they don't have that concept in lean, but we are not allowed to do our projects unless the politicians and the local community and society at large want us to. And if you look at the big failures in UK projects at the moment, what's slowing them down, it's the fact that they haven't got enough social capital. People don't want them, so they object. So they get tied up for years in planning processes. I wonder what it's like in Spain. But anyway, so we need to think about our input streams. Wasting concrete. It was interesting because I was looking at some amazing photographs of a fantastic Spanish concrete engineer earlier today, and if you look at those structures, what you can see is a ruthless attention, particularly in the shell arch structures that we're doing there to minimise concrete use. We have gone entirely the other way. I mean, how many buildings do you see and the columns are exactly the same on the ground floor and the top floor? I mean, they're not resisting any load on the top floor. Why are they the same size as the ground floor? Slabs that are flat all the way. We don't even coffer slabs. No, it's easier just to put a bit of wood on the bottom of them. It would break, but it has heart to see the way we deal with reinforced concrete at the moment. And when you go into it, it is probably in most reinforced concrete structures, about 40% of the material is actually doing anything useful. The rest of it is there to fill space because we don't know how to do curved shutters. Or it's there because the designer chucked a bit in to be sure, aimed for 80% utilisation, not for 100% utilisation. And so it goes. The optimal outcome, by the way, isn't necessarily a minimal structure, because that can be very costly, but considering these things is very important in the design of concrete structures. Another thing that is really clear as we talk about this is that we have fallen into the habit of talking about on-site and off-site construction. So we've created this duality, and you join one of these factions. I believe that on-site is the only way to go because everything's different always, or I believe that off-site is the way to go because we're building factories and it will be much, much better. And it was put to me by a chap called Keith Waller that actually we shouldn't have invented the term on-site or off-site, we should just build it in the right place. And I think what's really important for us is to think about construction through the lens of industrialisation. That's to say, we need to control the environment within which the construction happens, control the environmental variables, protect it from the weather, and build it where it's natural to build. And the project I've put up there, we did a few years ago in my day job, we did the Greek National Opera House and Library with Renzo Piano. And the structure you can see up there, that thing on the top right, is a 100 metre by 100 metre ferro cement canopy, solar canopy. And that was built on site. We built a factory, we employed hundreds of local people to actually make those units on site. So social value went into the local community, you upskilled them, and you built in the right place. Why? Because transporting ferrocement panels around the place is tricky to do. Why would you want to do that? And so the idea of building, and people do this, I mean, people like, I was out at HS2 in the Chilterns Tunnel, and they've built their own precasting yard there, and they've got their own batching plant, and they're building it in the place because they've decided that's the best way to deliver productive outcomes. But we don't challenge ourselves enough on that to think about how do we control the environment that we build in. I'll show you another example of that in a moment. The other thing that we don't do well enough is think about kit of parts design. So it's amazing how many different versions of a bridge over a road you will see. Again, maybe you're better at it in Spain, but in England it's notorious, in the UK it's notorious, is we don't think in terms of kits of parts. If you go onto our railway, every single coper that's ever designed will be new, as if no one has ever done a coper before. And so this is a piece of work with Network Rail, where if you look at infrastructure systems through the optic of products and processes, you go, what are the products we use a lot of? What are the processes we do a lot? Now let's pull those out and go, what's the best version of that we can do? When you do that, and this is a breakdown of the sort of kit of bits associated with stations, when you do that, you can break out different elements. And copers are the bits that sit on the edge of the station platform, if you're not familiar, the slab on the edge. And so this is a project looking at copers and trestle slabs, part of platforms as well, where you challenge yourself, like a product development engineer, to go, in version 1, what will it cost, how long will it take, what will the carbon footprint be? In version 2, can we do better? And you plan an improvement over time to enable you to do this better. Now, that's what you would do if you're in manufacturing. If you're a car manufacturer, that's what you think like. What's the next version of an engine going to be? We don't do that. The trestle slab, the coper slab we're talking about there was designed in 1954, and no one has touched it since. If you go out and buy a coper today, you're buying something that was designed in 1954 as a concept. That's mad. That's mad. We've got to be able to do better year on year. So thinking product is helpful and useful. Technology, we have a dilemma in our industry about technology. There are 3,500 digital tech startups wandering around, basically selling themselves to everybody. They're wandering around saying, does anyone want to buy a drone? Another drone? You want a different drone? I've got an app, another app, more drones, apps, and so on. Anyone familiar with that conversation? It happens a lot in my world. People selling tech products. What we don't do is we don't say, here's my process. This is the problem. How can I use technology to improve that? And that's what we should be doing. We should be using needs-led technology application, because the business case is made when you do it like that. The technology has a business case. Why? Because we went looking for it. The other way around doesn't tend to work so well. And finally, in this terms of controlling the physical environment, this is a project that we're doing just at the moment with the small modular reactor program for Rolls-Royce, working with BAM. And there's a chap called John Prothero who was looking at nuclear power stations, and he said what we should do is we should build them in giant sheds. And we should make these sheds so that they pop up and then we take them down and we go along, we build another one. That's what we should do. And that little idea, which has now been patented and is now a global patent for building in giant sheds, is an interesting idea, because what does it do to your construction program when you protect yourself from wind outages and weather and sun and dust, and you put 40 hooks onto the roof of a factory to enable you to lift everything you want, 40 of them, on a site that would normally accommodate 8 tower cranes? What does that do to your productivity? And the answer is, it halves the time of construction. That's what that does. And when you work out the cost of the shed, it's the same as the tower cranes. At which point, it looks like a very, very good idea against certain sorts of build. And this is the sort of thinking that is going to be necessary for us as we move into the 21st century and try and get better and faster and cleaner and leaner at what we do, because it allows us to build better. Finally, so that's a very brief canter through. I'm very conscious of time. And just to say that productivity, therefore, has been the theme this year at the ICE. There's a community advisory board who are working very hard. They've been consulting widely across industry. We're about to issue our annual State of the Nation report, which focuses on how to improve productivity in infrastructure. And that community advisory board will be continuing to do that. If anyone's interested, it's one of a number of community advisory boards which are up on the screen there. We organise our activities and this sort of knowledge development around these themes. And driving productivity is there, being led at the moment by Andy Alder and Darren James. If anyone's interested in hearing more about that, then drop us a line and we'll connect you up and you can see what's going on there. But without further ado, then I'm going to hand you over to Kate, who is going to give you her presentation, which is focused on construction logistics and public safety and so on. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Ed, for that useful insight into the infrastructure sector and the ways we can improve its productivity. We now have Kate. Kate Ken is a multi-award winning agent of change, a chartered civil engineer, chartered environmentalist, ICE fellow and council member of one of ICE's superheroes. Kate is a professional speaker, trainer and freelance consultant. She's also a construction disruptor, driving transformation of change in sustainable, safe and inclusive construction, engineering and logistics. Kate.
Gracias, Enrique. Buenas tardes a todos. Estoy encantada de estar aquí con vosotros en Madrid esta noche. That's it, that's all the Spanish you get in. Okay. Didn't practice with my clicker. It's the middle one, yeah? So we all know who Ed is, the President, so I just thought I'd better explain a little bit who on earth am I turning up with Ed on his presidential visit. So I've been heavily involved in the Institution of Civil Engineers. Enrique mentioned I'm a superhero. That was to do with the change I've helped drive in environment and sustainability. I was called Enviro Superhero. I'm a council member. I'm just finishing the second term of council, where I sit with Jose and Lucy. I'm a member of nomination committee, so I help decide who might be the next president. And I chair the Fairness, Inclusion and Respect Committee. I'm also on the Cycling Walking Community of Practice. In another role, I'm a Royal Academy of Engineering visiting professor at Durham University, and there I lecture and I teach engineering students on embedding sustainability and inclusivity in engineering. That's just coming to an end too. And thirdly, I am a freelance consultant. I'm a professional speaker. You're going to get a little taste of what I talk about tonight. I'm a trainer on construction logistics. I'm glad Ed mentioned process there, fishbone diagrams, Swiss cheese. That's what I use in my training to help improve things rather than just that panacea of technology and innovation as a solution to all our problems. It can be quite dangerous. I really agree with that. And my areas of expertise, if you like, are sustainability, safety, and inclusivity. And I can't read that now. How engineers transform lives and shape the world around us. That was the theme of the Superheroes exhibition. So I just want to flip that on its head, actually, and think about how we transform lives and shape the world around us unintentionally. What do we do that we don't intend to create an impact that we never intended? And Ed's kind of alluded to some examples of that. I don't know if you know, but there were 28,000 people killed or injured in the last 5 years by construction vehicles. That's in the UK. I'm not sure in Spain, I'm not sure in Europe, although I have had some idea a few years back. Per year, 500 people are killed or seriously injured, and there are 120 fatalities. Now, those of you familiar with safety stats in the UK will know there are about 30 to 40 people killed on site every year in the UK. On site. That means we are killing 4 times as many people off site. Is anybody talking about that? Do we count that? Does anyone even know? And heavy goods vehicles, lorries, trucks, our vehicles, make up in the UK only 4% of traffic. 4% of traffic, and yet we're involved in 78% of cyclist fatalities and 20% of pedestrians fatalities. That's grossly disproportionate. The risk we pose is massive. So for those who say, well, cyclists should wear high-vis and put on helmets and, they're so dangerous. Every time I speak, someone says, oh, well, I saw a cyclist go through a red light. Actually, our vehicles are killing, in real terms, in absolute numbers, twice as many pedestrians as we're killing cyclists. What do? Do we tell all the pedestrians to wear high-vis and helmets as they go about their business? And if you look at this graph here, you can see that the pedestrian is the dark blue on the bottom and the cyclist is the blue in the middle. And you can also see actually that for those under 10, that's 20, this is 10, children. We're killing children under 10. They're not even cyclists. So up to the age of 10, the majority of people that are killed are children, pedestrians. And then, again, as the older scale, so in the middle we have fit people generally cycling, but then we are killing our older pedestrians and our younger pedestrians as well. So, and these collisions, it's easy to talk about collisions and incidents, and I never, ever, ever use the term accident. There's a whole campaign called Crash Not Accident, because these are not accidents. They are really serious, violent, traumatic incidents. They're so painful, they're so prevalent, like we've just seen here, and they are so preventable. So that's an enormous number of people, but for every one of those people, for every number, there's a real person. And this is just one example of a real person. This is Ailey J. Cairns. She grew up on a beach in Northumberland in the UK. She loved the mountains, the ocean, and the desert. She was very active. She cycled everywhere she went. She even worked in Valencia, and she cycled to Valencia when she was in Spain. She actually cycled up to 10 miles every day on her route, so 20 miles every day round trip. Ailey was also my best friend, my confidant, and my little sister. She was 30 years old when she was cycling through London, through Notting Hill, Many of you might have heard of Notting Hill, famous for the carnival and for the film Notting Hill Gate. She was cycling through Notting Hill when she was struck from behind, dragged and crushed, and lay pinned by her pelvis under the wheels of a 32-ton fully laden tipper lorry. She quietly asked passers-by, "Please help me, please help me." The medics came, a fire engine came and lifted the truck off her. She was carried to the Royal London Hospital, but despite the team of trauma specialists there tirelessly pumping blood into her smashed body, she died 2 hours later. João Lopes, the driver, 52 years old, Portuguese, he said he did not see her. He was given a £250 fine, 3 points on his licence, and he carried on his job. His employer allowed him to carry on his job. Who's this then? This is Nora Gutman. She's a 97-year-old Holocaust survivor. 15 months after running down Ailey, João Lopes ran down and killed Nora Gutman on a pedestrian crossing in London. Her grandson said she had a zest for life. She walked up to an hour every day. As I saw that, that's 3 families destroyed. At that point, João Lopes was convicted of dangerous driving, and he was given a 4-year jail sentence. Nora's family contacted me, and they asked me to go to the court case. We wrote a joint statement to the judge asking that we didn't want any blame or retribution. All we wanted was that João Lopes never be allowed to drive a truck again. The judge told us it wasn't up to us to determine what happens. That was his job. And 2 years later, João Lopes came out of jail. Whether he's driving or not, I'm not sure. But I did not blame João Lopes. When I started looking into this, I realized that there are so many failures in our logistics that lead to incidents like this. So many failures that are completely preventable and completely avoidable if we put in place processes like Ed talked about. Using best practice is not even happening at the moment. And if we look at the lorry design over the last few years, 2 or 3 decades, we can see that it hardly changed from the 1970s up to 2010, 2014. 2010, so that's when Ailey died, 2009, and then the vehicles started to change from then on. And you can see on that 2015 one, that's a low-entry, direct vision lorry. That is the kind of vehicle that I think all our construction projects should be using to carry our stuff to and from our sites, because these vehicles are only on the road because we're building our projects. And you can see the N3 vehicle. This is an off-road vehicle most people procure when they're carrying lots of stuff. So the most prevalent vehicles in deaths are concrete mixers and skip lorries. And tipper trucks, and these are the off-road vehicles. And you can see that there's nearly a 500-metre underrun below the bumper of a vehicle. That's just the right height to pull in a buggy or somebody on a bike. And the blind spots are absolutely massive. You can fit up to 19 cyclists in front of one of these legally compliant vehicles, completely legal, and they're all invisible to the driver. He's got his mirrors, she's got her mirrors, but these cyclists fall within the blind spots within that mirror, within that vehicle. So, being an engineer, I did not accept this as a problem. Obviously, I was heartbroken about my sister, 2 deaths. That's not a coincidence. And I just kept watching the news, and week after week, month after month, more people killed under the wheels of our trucks in London and in other cities across the UK. Every time the driver just said, I didn't see them. So I founded the See Me, Save Me campaign to try and make a change. First of all, I thought it was about lorries not having enough mirrors. Then I found out that it takes up to 6 seconds to look in each mirror and the road ahead. So drivers haven't even got time to look in all the mirrors on the road ahead. So then I decided it was about sensors, cameras and sensors. So I campaigned to change law through European Parliament, went to Brussels and to Strasbourg to make it mandatory to have cameras and sensors on these vehicles to compensate for the blind spots. Then what happened was that drivers were telling me that they had cognitive overload. There was, had to look in the mirrors, the alarms were going off, they had to look in the screen. So they were putting chewing gum on the sensors and they were cutting the wires in the cameras. So again, this goes back to process and how we do things. And it's not, you can put all the innovation you want in, but it has to be workable. We have to talk to drivers, we have to look at processes. So my campaign was heard in the House of Lords, the UK House of Lords, both Houses of Parliament. I contacted my MP, I contacted my MEP as well. I gave evidence in the House of Parliament, and this is the House of Commons Cycling Safety Report out in 2014-15. I was quoted in that report about what the industry can do, or the industry should make change or bring in standards to manage this risk. This is that Brussels or Strasbourg? Can't remember. That's Strasbourg, I think, when we were campaigning for change, and we actually achieved a change in European Directive 96/53 to European law on cab design to change the design of cabs so you've got better visibility. At that point, we had 36, I think it was 36 mayors from different cities across Europe who wrote to support the campaign and this change in the law. I also became a politician, a local politician in the northeast, and campaigned to have sensors put on our local vehicles in the northeast and to have clocks embedded in our procurement process. I've won some awards. This is Princess Anne here, who I met at an awards evening where we talked about road safety, because she's a patron of road safety. But that's another whole story there. And then, so I campaigned to change the law. Then I knew that where my experience in sustainability, I helped develop the world first standard to improve sustainability in civil engineering, and we didn't do that through changing the law because it's about going beyond compliance. We did that through a voluntary industry standard, getting the industry buy-in, hoping that people want to be responsible and to do better. So then I started campaigning within industry, and this is there was a double-page spread in New Civil Engineer magazine, which I'm sure you all read, and I've written lots of briefing material and papers as well. And the media is obviously really powerful as well, because we're all worried about our reputation. We won't win work and do business if we have a poor reputation. So I also had a lot of media, TV and radio coverage, and live on Radio 4. That was probably the most scary thing I did. Oh, and the other thing is there's a white bike at Notting Hill Gate where Ailey died. And we got permission from the Mayor of London to erect that as a piece of art. And somebody was cycling past that. She was a playwright, and she saw it, and she heard the story, and she actually wrote a play called The White Bike, which was produced in the East End of London and actually featured at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. So I suppose what I'm saying, there are a lot of ways to create change. At first I thought it was about changing the law in technology, but actually it's a lot more complicated than that. And so then in 2013, after all this campaigning, clocks, the Construction, Logistics and Cyclist Safety Group was formed at that point. That was because at that time people were still thinking it was all about cyclists. Clocks did research, and they came out with these three conclusions: that construction vehicles are grossly disproportionate in cyclist deaths. We've got massive complacency. We manage our risk on site. We don't even consider our off risk beyond the site boundary risk that we pose. And there's this big discrepancy between on-site safety, where we've got RIDDOR, we've got safety shutdowns, you have to wear your hat, you can't smoke on site, and then off-site, we kill people 10 metres off-site beyond the site boundary and nobody even knows about it. And that's when we come to work-related road risk concept. And so the solution was that we developed this world-first standard to manage work-related road risk. So you can see on the Clocks website, there's a standard, and it's all about ensuring the safest construction vehicle journeys. And now we've broadened it out to be about clean and lean too, because when we're safer, we're actually more efficient and we can be more productive. and we engage the whole of the supply chain. So Ed talked about there about the basic conflict of interest there is within our industry in trying to deliver a sustainable world. We all benefit from pouring concrete and building with steel. We don't all benefit from building, sustainable, light touch, blue, green infrastructure necessarily. So this is about engaging the whole supply chain from the regulator right down to the fleet operator. The regulator and the client, they have the power, they have the influence. They can put this standard in their procurement documents and contract documents. And then we've got the fleet operators at the bottom of the chain. By the time we leave it to them, it's too late. And Ed had that graph about the most influence early on, and then further down the project or through the process, there's much less influence to change. And that's exactly the same in this area. If we think about using alternative logistics, reverse logistics, trains, other modes, safer modes, it's much easier to determine that upfront early in the project. So we want the influence going down the supply chain and the information coming back up the supply chain. So that information I told you about, drivers cutting wires, putting chewing gum on sensors, they told me because I asked them and I talked to them and I engaged with them. Senior leadership often don't do that. They don't necessarily engage with the right people. We think we know best, and we implement stuff for other people to do. So we've had massive buy-in across industry in the UK from regulators, industry bodies, clients, contractors and vehicle manufacturers, and communicators, so that ICE was a communicator helping promote clocks. ICE is a clocks champion. So we have these standards helping clocks in planning, procuring clocks for compliance, procuring subcontractors and managing non-compliance. There's an awful lot of information available through the clock standard and through the clocks process and on the clocks website. Regulators, we ask regulators to request construction logistics plans. So a lot of this hinges around a construction logistics plan which is developed at the start and then referred to throughout the process. So it's a focal point, a process that everyone can follow. And these are the kind of industry organisations that evolved or clocks champions. This is some clients. We want clients to make sure that specify it in the contract documents, but also make sure there's compliance and it's implemented down the supply chain. Contractors as well have roles to make sure that construction logistics plan is implemented and that they make sure it's complied with. So I just wanted to mention the direct vision standard. This came out of what I would claim came out of the work we did in Europe back in 2013. And you'll see this vehicle on the bottom. So the vehicle on top is the original one I showed. This vehicle on the bottom clearly shows there's about 200 mil now underneath the bumper. There are mirrors on the near side of the vehicle, and it's massively improved the direct visibility. The driver can just see out of the window. Doesn't have to look in a mirror, the cameras, the sensors, you can just see. And if you have eye contact, then that person on the bike is a real person. There's a connection, there's a human connection. It's not just some rogue on a bike that you're not bothered about that's in their way. It really creates an emotional connection, which helps drivers drive more empathetically. And one of the groundbreaking things which I really pushed for within the clock standard was to get drivers on bikes. So we have a lot of campaigns where we get cyclists sitting in trucks to see how dangerous it is, but what's been one of the most effective things is getting drivers out of the truck on a bicycle and to feel what it's like to be cycling down the road when a truck comes by. Other documents to support this, we've specifically written a document for planners to help planners implement clocks because it starts at the planning process and it starts at procurement. And we have, we're promoting it within procurement frameworks, and these are two that have adopted it in the UK. The Institution of Civil Engineers has produced its own guidance for designers. I co-authored that with people from the Health and Safety Committee. And then clocks is referred to in the construction playgroup, and we've got lots of guidance, as I just talked about, on the website. So it's about taking that all the way down the supply chain, right from the planner and the client, right down to the operator on site. And we've shown that it works. We've shown that this is figures from Camden, for example. When Camden, that's the London Borough, when Camden, very, very busy London Borough, around near King's Cross, when Camden implemented clocks, they saw a 47% reduction in casualty rate, and they also saw a 37% reduction in complaints as well from the communities. We can't say that's causal, we can't say it's because of clocks, but we can say there's a correlation. And we all want our cities to be more, one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals is sustainable cities and communities. I just did a little run around town today and I had to cross some major roads, buses, cars. It was not very pedestrian friendly. It was not very friendly for active travel. We need our cities to be more sustainable. We need more active travel. These two pictures on the right and the bottom, by the way, they're not the UK. This is the UK where these cyclists ram together on our streets. And some of our bridges in London, we now have more cyclists going over them, a lot more cyclists than vehicles in rush hour. So when we build the infrastructure and we create the safe streets, then people are more inclined to get on their bikes and cycle and scoot. In the UK, we're having policies, national government policies to promote active travel. It's been huge post-COVID. We need people out of having the options of travelling independently and out in the fresh air and creating more space for that. We just launched a new Active Travel England agency as well, which is currently recruiting its non-executive directors and building up a presence to specifically look at this. So many of our projects, organisations, we all have very strong kind of safety morals and visions and values, and these are some, everyone home safe every day, safety first, zero harm. But what do we really mean by that? Do we really mean everyone involved, everyone affected by our project, or we just mean within the site? Or are we in boundaries to our vision? And we've talked a lot in the UK at the IC about Dame Judith Hackett's In Plain Sight report. That was following Grenfell, where 72 people died in a horrendous incident in London. And I was just reading that. Many of the words in that relate to construction logistics, and have done for a long, long time. So there's been a big response to this inquiry and that we must do something and we must change. But it talks about catastrophic infrastructure failure is low, crucially, and over the recent decades, gradually and sometimes imperceptibly, risks have weakened long-established mitigations or lines of defence. Well, I would argue that in this case, catastrophic failure is actually very common. We talked about the statistics, and Ed said before about doing things right, doing the right things and doing things right, and he said, it's not that we're not safe. Well, in this case, we are not safe. We're not only not safe, we're actually killing people, not our own people, those who have chosen to come to our sites to work in our industry. We're killing young people, children, professionals, people just going about their daily business. And the third point there is all members should have full regard for public interest, particularly in relation to matters of health and safety and in relation to the well-being of future generations. How can we say we're doing that when we're routinely responsible for the deaths of so many people off sites? So the good thing about this, the good story, is that when we implement safe vehicles, safe drivers, safe processes, when we identify our risks and we manage those risks, then we also improve congestion, we improve efficiency, productivity, sustainability, we contribute to net zero embodied energy if we're having less trucks and more efficient trucks carrying stuff to our site, we're reducing embodied energy. We also improve our reputation and create a license to operate. We have fewer claims, fewer spurious claims, we have less delay, so in the end we save money, because a lot of this sometimes comes down to money. But I wager, I can guarantee that if we consider construction logistics early on, we identify the risk, we manage the risk, we can definitely save money, as Ed's graph was showing earlier on before. So this is not in Hillgate, this is the white bike there, and that's the plaque. That's all that rests of Ailey J. Cairns, my little sister. And so I've fought for a few years now to be heard, to have this issue recognised, acknowledged even, and then addressed. But now I'm a professional speaker. You've had a little taste today. of what I talk about. I speak at industry forums and leadership events about how we manage out this risk. And I also have adopted the hierarchy of controls, so you might be familiar with risk management, and applying that to road risk, what we can do to manage that road risk. And we can see that the wrong place to start is cyclist behaviour and appearance. Often the knee-jerk reaction is what I said at the start, oh, well, you need to wear a high vis, you need to wear a helmet. I can tell you that the truck was on top of my sister's pelvis. I contacted every medical person I possibly could, and they were very frank with me. They said she was practically cut in half. A helmet would not have done anything. If one of these trucks hits you at 2 miles per hour, you're likely to die. And they crush the pelvis. So it's not to do with speed, even it's to do with mass momentum. You know, it's plain physics. So it's up to us. We are posing the risk. We manage the risk. So we are best placed to do that, to reduce the risk. And we need to look at risks and opportunities, and that's what I do with my clients in my training, and use the Swiss cheese method, which was talked about a lot in plain sight, to look at the hazards and the barriers, the preventative barriers that we can put in place, because there are so many barriers we can put in place, so many barriers to prevent these things happening. That I just saw on the press last night that someone was killed in Oxford recently. She was at Oxford University, very bright, and apparently the driver had a string of offences. He was uninsured, he had no licence, and he tested positive for cocaine in his blood. Do we really have these people in our supply chain delivering stuff to our projects in charge of massive trucks? How does that happen? How are we being responsible and sustainable and safe if we do that? Not that we shouldn't employ people. We need to make sure that we don't put inadequate people in dangerous situations, and we give them the right tools and the training to do what is a really, really difficult job. So that's what I do now. I've really think that I've influenced change, and at a European level as well. We had a real push and really high profile in Europe when we campaigned to change that law. And to be honest, we've been focusing on the UK and London and working out even beyond the London. So it's really nice to be back here in Spain, in Madrid. And there was massive support for the See Me, Say Me campaign when we went to Brussels and to Strasbourg from MPs. So as Fiona Hall said there, HGVs across Europe will look different and be safer. So I hope that you can think about what you can do as an organisation, what you can do with your clients, and what you can do within your supply chain to ensure that you've got the safest drivers and the safest vehicles, and you're identifying and managing the risk that we surely pose. So I presented this paper to Council recently, which is, I think, why we came here, and the institution. From that, I'm working with Mark, Director of Knowledge at the ICE, and we kind of identified some actions around awareness, learning and implementation. So that's what the, we could talk about those later if you like, but that's what the ICE is doing. So yeah, I'm really interested in hearing your views. If you think this is relevant to you, what do you think is within your power? What would you like to do but it's not possible? What barriers or restrictions or restraints are there? So thank you very much for listening. Gracias. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you very much, Ed. Very interesting presentation. We now open a debate. If you have any questions, please introduce yourself and put forward that question. It occurs to me to start off. What's the main barriers that we actually need to face when changing mentalities? It comes to mind, a tragedy last year. I think it was a car ran over a couple of girls at the school in Madrid. One of them was killed, apparently. The mother was this mother was picking up her children from school, but when departing, when leaving the place, well, she lost control of her car, and she ran over these two girls. I remember the immediate reaction of well, politicians and people as a whole was to actually find someone to blame. Initially, the blame was placed on the driver. Oh, she wasn't paying attention. Then it was placed on the car, on the make. It was a Volvo SUV. But it was transparent that it was considered an accident. And people considered this an accident, not something preventable. And how can you actually influence people's minds and go for well, improving efficiency, sustainability of a scheme like this when you have that barrier at start? If you want to answer.
I think what you've put your thumb on there is exactly the right point. As soon as we say it's an accident, it's like, oh, well, you know, I knocked that on the phone. It's an accident. It's not an accident. You know, first, we can't see out of the truck. So for anyone paying attention 100% of the time, totally at the top of their game, it's difficult. Then we have drivers that are tired. Then we have drivers that can't see. Then we have drivers that are stressed because they're late. I've actually been on training at one of the biggest projects in, I'm not going to say the name, but one of the biggest projects in the UK, in fact, Europe. They do excellent training. And the drivers there told me that they complained that they couldn't get from A to B within the time frame. They were on training to manage construction and just safety. And he said to me that his boss told him if he complained again, he was going to lose his job. Shut up and get on with the job. So a lot of this is about behaviour, it's about culture, it's about training, it's about competence. And when I worked on Terminal 5, we had health and well-being. There's a lot of talk about mental health and well-being right now. We had health and well-being, we had people come on and check blood pressure, people that are overweight, fitness. And yet we put these drivers under enormous pressure and we have no margin for error. And isn't that what we do as engineers? Everyone is human. Everyone's going to make a mistake. So if I cycle 2 millimeters to the right, do I really have to put my life in danger? So we need to design out risk with our infrastructure. And we need to design out risk whilst looking at our logistics. So we train our drivers, we have direct vision, low entry lorries, and we create a culture where it's okay to be late, or we account for time to be late, or we're more efficient. Going back to what Ed says, we manufacture in the factory, we transport to site in one load, or we use the river, or we use the road, or we use reverse logistics. It's one point that I thought about when you were talking. Do you know the most common product that we transport in trucks? The most common thing we move by volume is fresh air. What a waste. So why don't we use reverse logistics? If we just plan, we can use consolidation centres and we're just removing that risk. But we know some projects we do that, and that should be the norm. That should be what Ed's talking about, processes, efficiencies and best practice and considering early. Instead of just leaving it to the last minute. That concrete wall that you talked about, how many new concrete mixers are going to have to come in and fix that wall now? Again, extra risk on the road that just doesn't have to be there. So it's a very holistic issue. Whilst it seems simple, it's actually very complicated, and this is what I worked out when I was first working out why my sister died. And I start simply, but I ended up with a massive issues, which one might call now a mind map. But it's the justice system as well. I had to fight the police because they just thought, oh, it's a girl on a bike. You know, she's really fit, she was really active, she knew what she was doing. But too easy to say, oh, it's an accident. So that actually cultural attitude of accidents is one of the biggest problems. And I'll just say, because I know I'm talking now, in the rail industry and in the air industry, in marine, we don't talk about a plane accident. We don't talk about train accident. We talk about a crash. Okay, what's gone wrong? We need to stop it. When we have a fatality on site, we have a shutdown. We have lessons learned until we determine why that happened so it doesn't happen again. So it's not just our industry, it's a whole societal culture. And by the way, road safety is in the Sustainable Development Goals under health and well-being. Is a target under 3. It's actually, road death is the biggest killer of our young people globally. What is that all about? A man-made, endemic. So we need to change that culture. What does anyone else think?
Hello, this is I don't think that's not on.
No, that's not.
Hello, yeah, now it's working. José Lórez, council member of the IC and colegiado here in Madrid. I have a question for Ed. You know, I'm quite interested in trying to get European members to get involved in bringing in knowledge and ideas to try and bring into the IC pipeline. Out of your experience, international experience, which topics do you think could be key in the case of European, or in this case Spanish members or engineers, to bring into the IC knowledge pipeline?
I mean, the IC strategically focuses on 5 areas. So in a sense that we set an agenda, and the agenda at the moment is driven by carbon and how do we net zero carbon infrastructure around the world. Secondly, climate adaptation, so how do we adapt to a changing climate. Thirdly, productivity, how do we do all of this stuff without damaging things and deliver better value for money for people. Fourthly, we focus on water supply and water provision, and fifth, the general issue of technical competence and professional ethics. So those are the 5 things that trustees have signed off on at the moment. And that's come from analysis of what do we need to fix and address the challenges of the 21st century. You know, so we've set that agenda, and so I think in a way, it's partly an answer to Kate's or the conversation you were just having, where timing is critical for things to change. There's always the same pattern. There are small groups of highly motivated people who are determined to make a change. It's number 1. Number 2 is they have to be operating in an environment which is conducive, where people are prepared to listen. Those 2 things have to happen, and you have to be talking about something that's really, really important. So if you haven't got a committed group of people, you haven't got a conducive environment, and you haven't got a theme of great importance, nothing will happen. It'll just die, and it's always been the way. And so at the moment, we've got, if you think about themes around climate and carbon, you've now got largely a political consensus, an international political consensus, that something needs to be done, and that something involves reducing the amount of carbon dioxide and associated gases that are emitted. That's that wasn't true 5 years ago, but after COP26, 79% of global emissions are now under, well, it's in excess of 70% of global emissions are now associated with countries who are committed to getting rid of them. You know, so that's a huge step forward from 5 years ago. So the answer to the question is focus on those 5 things. What have you got to say? What have you got to bring to the conversation? Because we believe that there is a fertile ground. These are critical issues, and we're interested in small groups of people. In the way that Kate has really driven this with her small group of people to change the world in relation to this subject, it falls to small groups of people who understand, passionate around themes within that area. And there's loads within this. So the IC this year we've issued a route map to net zero concrete. We didn't produce it, actually, we helped produce it, but it was produced by another group of small, highly committed people who worked really hard for 3 years to produce a route map that said this is what we've got to do if we want to make concrete net zero by 2050. And the ICE's piled in and said, okay, we'll help, we'll put a framework around it and we'll support that. So there's stuff in there which is about inventing new cements. There's stuff in there about using the right reinforcing steel and specifying concrete appropriately. So there's lots to do, but you need to get engaged with, if you like, the big stories of the day, where we have a kind of political consensus around them, and then you need to be really determined in the way that Kate has been really determined on this. It must be 10 years ago since I first heard you talk about this, Kate. It takes a long time. It's a huge personal commitment to do this stuff. But it always was that. It always was. From the guy who set up the colegio, by the way, those characters, the people who decided actually what we need is one of these things, and they decided to do something.
I think the Knowledge Cafe, which is this brand new initiative by the IC, is very interesting because it's bringing people together in those small groups, working groups. And,
I think what's happened post-COVID is the digital. Historically, we met in rooms drinking coffee, and if you couldn't get to the room, you didn't get any coffee and you didn't participate in the discussion. And in the last year or two, we've seen a massive transition into this place where you can have international conversations, you can stimulate through these sort of we've set up a Knowledge Cafe, which is a forum for people to talk about these things, what José's talking about. But yeah, I think actually this is a tremendous opportunity, and I know the Colegio is doing a digital offering, you're having digital debates. It would be really interesting to see to what extent we can tap into each other's conversations and share experiences across that. I'm sure there's lots of really interesting stuff that you're doing that we could hook into if we can get past language barriers. Maybe that's the next thing we've got to do, digital translators. But yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Enrique. Lucy Roux, I'm an IC member of council. I live in France. Kate, I wanted to thank you for sharing what must be quite painful for you, this part of your personal history. You started off with a really shocking statistic. In the UK, in the last 5 years, over 28,000 people were killed or injured in the United Kingdom by construction vehicles. I have no idea what that figure is in France, and I doubt that anybody in this room knows what that figure is in Spain. What can we do to bring this to the attention of those that can influence and make changes to the way we run our construction sites?
That's a really good question. And what is it, that quote, though, that which we measure, we manage, and we as engineers like data and statistics, and how often have I heard it must be data-led? Sometimes you've just got to chuck that out. Something we all know fundamentally, we can all feel is inherently wrong when you've got a big truck running over little children. It's like David and Goliath, isn't it? It's like the giant with a little boy with a sling. It's pretty obvious. So we have got the statistics, but we didn't have the statistics when I started. And in the UK, we have what's called Stats 19, where the police collect statistics, and they didn't actually separate out HGV deaths. So we couldn't even, I knew because I saw the newspaper again, a tipper lorry again, a young, healthy, active, intelligent woman again. You know, it's heartbreaking. So I don't think we necessarily need to wait for the statistics. It just makes good business sense to have drivers that are fit, driving vehicles to be efficient, to be productive, to be sustainable, you know, all those benefits. I started off on safety, but one thing that I learned, I picked up from a politician, actually, spin doctor, Alistair Campbell. It was in a park in London. It was a charity race. And I nobbled him, I got hold of him, and I said, can you help me with this campaign? And the one thing he said to me was that you need to streamline with others' agendas, which is exactly what you're saying. You need to slip in, to segue into other people's agendas. So whatever they're talking about, if it's cost savings, you need to talk about. If it's money, you need to talk about the cost savings. If it's environment, you need to talk about sustainability. With this issue, it's kind of, how can you afford not to do it? Because there are so many benefits. In my training, we talk about the risks and we talk about the opportunities. There are so many benefits and there are so many risks that are bad in every sense, reputation, cost, well-being, that why would you not do it? And with the segueing and not bringing something new, you know, we do risk assessment, we do risk management, we have risk registers. This is nothing new. So what I help people do is identify the road risk, the risks within that whole issue that I just talked about earlier, get them on the risk register, work out how to mitigate those risks. So we're not doing anything new, we're just bringing something else into our existing processes, which is not too scary, it's just an omission or a blind spot, if you like, in our processes. So why would you not do that? Do we have to wait for the stats, and do we have to know exactly how many people and exactly what vehicle? The clocks research shows the blind spots, that's pretty clear. We know that. And actually, when I did run the See Me Save Me campaign and we went to Brussels with a written declaration, only 10% of written declarations get through, by the way, and we had unanimous support for our written declaration, which meant the Commission had to respond to it. You know, every country, we spent 3 days knocking on the doors of MEPs, hundreds of MEPs, and not one MEP said, this isn't a good idea, I don't think we should be doing this. It's kind of common sense to me anyway.
So we can all do something, is what you're saying? Mm.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any more questions from the audience? Fernando.
Thank you. Fernando Ruiz from the Spanish Council of Civil Engineers. Thank you very much, Kate, for your conference. I have a daughter, my youngest daughter, that had a terrible accident in bicycle during the pandemic. It was not due at all to construction issues, but I am quite sensitive to this issue. So thank you very much for all your work in this issue. And to Ed, excellent conference. Thank you very much. And I think that behind all your graphics, there is lack of quality. I mean all these problems. Many of these problems is lack of quality of the design, lack of quality of the construction, and so on. And again, after the pandemic, I think that there is an important risk that companies, I come from the engineering sector, and companies have the temptation to hire engineers with less qualifications. I mean, since engineers don't need to be working on site, and they can hire engineers from countries probably with a level of education lower, much cheaper, I think this trend will be against getting better designs and solving all these problems you mentioned. What do you think about this remote working and how it can affect to the quality, especially of designs?
Yes, I think that you're first of all breaking it apart a little bit and say the one when they study and Harvard did a big piece looking at what makes a successful project, and they attempted to correlate project success to the form of contract, the budget, and whether it was a reasonable budget, all these different things. They could get no correlation at all with those things. The only thing they got a correlation with was the self-assessed quality of team. So successful projects in the end turn out to be about putting the right people together. And the right people is about having the right knowledge, but also the right attitudes, the right energy, and the right behavioural performance with each other. So, and what that means in the end, all of this comes back to the calibre of the people who are working on these projects. and the calibre of the people who work in our industry, and getting those people to perform well. So first of all, really important to have people with the right skills, the right attitudes and all the rest of it. And that's down to us, by the way. The more senior you are, the more influence you have in your company. You create the people, you hire them, you teach them how to be and how to behave like an engineer. We do the formation projects, the colegios, the universities and so on. So that's us. And then there's something really important which is about performance. And there's something interesting when you look at a study of errors, and I did look a lot at causal factors on errors. What you often find is that errors are carried out by perfectly competent people. That 2 minutes before they made the mistake, you would have looked at them and said, they're competent. And maybe that guy, you would have looked at him and said, he can drive. 2 minutes before the big moment, he hadn't had that accident, and everyone would have said, fine, he's fine, he's fine. But his performance in those critical moments was inadequate. And that tends to be the case when you look at things going wrong. It's often performance rather than core competence. Not always, but often. And so we need to get good performance out of good people. We've got to get good people for them, we've got to get good performance. So I come on to this question of hybrid working and working in the office and so on. And I think there are a multiplicity of answers to that. It always depends. So you can waste a lot of time travelling to and from offices and doing nothing very productive in them. And we've all been guilty of that from time to time. You can have super productive experiences working at home where you're massively focused and you're able to contact the 2 or 3 people you need to work with through Teams and resolve tricky problems in the moment. In principle, you can learn how to be an engineer sitting at home as well, but that becomes more challenging. And I suppose the jury is out. We don't know what the answer to the long-term effects of hybrid working are. But I do think we have to be very deliberate and careful in understanding how to get performance out of teams when they are operating in distributed fashions through different media, because it's clear that some people struggle with isolation, they can't concentrate, and but some people benefit from it. So I'm afraid it's not a conclusive answer other than to say we need to focus on capability and ability and the quality of people we have, and we have to focus on performance, but that the answers we'll get from both of those are not simply let's all work in an office, let's all work at home. It's much more nuanced than that. And clearly it's really obvious in my office, the opportunity to do hybrid working has really improved the quality of life of a number of people, particularly those with young children, who are just much more able to make their lives work without a 1.5 hour commute in and out, and without the fixed hours being out of the office. They're able to structure their workday to be healthier, to be happier in their work and more productive. So I think, yeah, it's a long answer to a short question, but I think we can't make too many assertions just yet. And I think we should keep going with the sort of global experiment in hybrid working for a while and really try and make it work, because the benefits are very significant, or potential benefits are very significant, in my view.
Thank you very much. Any other question?
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
My name's Robert Sizer. I'm a British chartered civil engineer working in Spain. Firstly, very powerful, and from both of yourselves, great presentation, and thank you very much for coming here. I wanted to take a chance to speak to you about something slightly different. You talked about the 5 topics, Ed. Where do you think about water and water management is in terms of, this is obviously now an emerging topic, climate change. We don't have enough water in some cases. So I read in the news, the UK's in drought. You can't turn on your hose pipes. Next thing I read, massive flooding.
Yeah.
You know, there's flooding in the streets. It's raining here now in Madrid. It was raining in Seville this morning. It's, you know, massive swings and changes. The dams are running dry. What's your thoughts on that? And is that one of the next big topics?
Well, I think at the moment that we're tucked into climate adaptation, and so yeah, and it's a huge issue. Obviously, it's quite clear that our approach to water infrastructure in the UK has not worked for us in recent. It's increasingly clear, and you know, whether we're talking about a combined sewerage system that is just not fit for purpose, or a water supply system which is very increasingly vulnerable to drought periods, is not working. And if you look at the way that the investment programs have worked through the water companies, all the rest of it, it's very hard to defend. And so anyway, so all of this it's rising up the agenda, and we have a group looking at these issues within the knowledge cafe that Jose was talking about. But it tucks into a series of related issues within climate adaptation. I think some of the interesting things that have come out to our approach to infrastructure, and again, you may not be guilty of it in Spain, but in the UK, we compartmentalised infrastructure systems in a really quite sort of dramatic way. So if you're a water company and you want to do power generation, you can't. You know, you're only allowed to spend taxpayers' money on water. So if I happen to be sitting there with 2 reservoirs that I could use as pump storage, or, you know, to balance diurnal variations in renewable energy production from wind, for example, that's really tricky to do, because I do water, I don't do power. And you have a curiosity in the UK where we build major infrastructure crossings like the Lower Thames crossing, and we put a road through it. If we were in Norway, we put a road and a railway line through it. Why don't we do that in the UK? And the answer is because the people who do highways do highways. They cannot spend money on railways. Now, so at a national level, this is really odd and slightly insane. Maybe you don't do it here, but it's to do with an attitude to the way that infrastructure is designed, planned and operated. And I think if we're going to answer the challenges of the 21st century, actually we mustn't just be talking about water in a little box around it, call that drainage, call that water supply. Actually, the solution to our problems is much more integrated than that. It's madness to talk about transportation without talking about urbanism. Cities are about streets and public spaces more than they are about buildings. And to sort of carve this out as a different sort of discipline has got us into trouble. And so we need to be able to adopt systemic thinking across all of these different discipline areas as we front up to the challenges of the 21st century. And we haven't really got the intellectual toolkit to do it at the moment. We've got quite good at understanding roads and dams and bridges and all the rest of it. We're not very good at combining these systems and integrating them in our solutioneering and our conceptualization.
Thank you very much. Any other question? That's going to be the last one, and then we can go to have something to eat and drink, fine wine, yes, and discuss over there.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kate and Ned. Just back to safety. Jose Las Heras, IC BEM. Back to safety. Just wanted to mention what Enrique said. Accidents do happen. Fatalities do happen. This is the atmosphere we work on. But I wanted to know how the ICE interact with, and all the institutions interact with companies to make them embrace these target zero policies and force them to spend more money, realistically, in preventing accidents.
So that's the question. In how is the ICE helping do the stuff that I want everyone to do? That's the question. What? So
how they push other companies?
Yeah. Good question. Well, when I presented the paper to council, we came out with some resolutions which I put up earlier. We're going to develop some CPD on clocks. That will just be basic information. We will be signposting to other training and information that's out there. The other thing that we decided is we'd raise this agenda on the infrastructure clients group and another group to do with contracts or procurement, to try and disseminate this. And to go back to what you said just before about collaboration and error, that's why we produced a guide for designers on clocks, because designers traditionally aren't necessarily thinking about logistics or how this massive pane of glass is necessarily going to get to site. They're just thinking about their product, their design and their materials. And so this integration that Ed was talking about is really crucial, and that's why I think logistics is so inefficient, because it's not really incorporated in the programme early enough. So I hope with the ICE promoting clocks and that collaboration that comes along with it, the construction logistics plan which pulls everyone in, then we can see early on the savings to be made, the opportunities to be made, which should speak for themselves as an influence, as a driver. You know, I don't want anyone just to do this because Kate Cairns says it's a good idea. Well, it is, but also there are so many other opportunities. So I think it's about highlighting those opportunities and the risks that I talked about before, raising that awareness and how we mitigate them, just like we do in any other risk management. We look at risks and opportunities, and we have risk registers and SWOT analysis, etc., etc. We just need to include this in those tools that we already use, rather than necessarily make people change the way they do things, because we already have those visions of safety, we already have aspirations of sustainability that I talked about earlier. Everyone has their strapline. So if we can show organisations or leaders or influencers how they're not meeting that in this area, then it's kind of obvious, I think. But we're working at the IC on how we can kind of spread out that influence and disseminate that knowledge.
Just it's sort of, that's one thing you might want to influence people on. So the first thing you have to do when you're something like an institution, you are something, but you're not everything. You know, we have a certain audience, we have certain capability or capacity to influence, and we have a certain network, which isn't everybody. And so the way we deal with this, because we get asked to engage with different agendas all the time. So it might be safety, it might be carbon, it might be water, it might be any number of things. Recently it's been refugees, it's been, you know, what are you doing about this? And so from an organisational perspective, the question you have to ask yourself, first of all, is this in scope? Is it something we even can talk about? Is anyone going to listen to us on this? Have we any influence? The second thing, having decided that yes it is, and for example in construction logistics and net zero programs it's definitely in scope, then the question you ask is, well, who needs to be influenced and who's best placed to do the influencing? And depending on the answer to that question, you decide what you do. Sometimes it will be us. Sometimes it will be we need to go and speak to the departments and the politicians and speak to them. Sometimes it will be by trying to give Kate a platform and saying, you're the best person to influence this, you've got that network. Or it might be going to another. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of organisations in the sort of ecosystem around construction. And some of them, their entire world is focused on some of these issues. And for an institution like ours, the best thing to do is just help them, enable them, sort of stand behind them and put your logo on their letters so that they get listened to in a different way. So again, the answer to your question is basically, is it in scope? And then who's the audience? And how do we help get the message to the audience? And sometimes we don't do much, and sometimes we do quite a lot. There we are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Ed. Thank you, Kate. We're gonna conclude this European presidential address. So now over to you, Esther.
Thank you, Enrique. We are now approaching the end of the session, and I would like to thank the presenters we had today, to all of you for your participation, and also to all the team that has made it possible. Thank you very much. I have personally found it very interesting, and I really hope you did too. We have talked about such interesting topic for the engineering community as efficiency and effectiveness, and we have seen some examples on how engineers are contributing to improve our society. Before we leave, I just want to say that the Spanish Council of Civil Engineers has the courtesy of inviting all of you to a cocktail that allows us the opportunity to keep on interchanging experiences and establishing contacts that will improve our knowledge and performance of our profession. Thank you again, and see you all soon.